Cynthia Killian here, also known as Psychic Cynthia, and welcome. Welcome to our Connecting with Your Ancestors and Ancestral Spirits class series. And this little video that I'm preparing for you today is to just help get you started in the course before we even officially start. So it's a little warm up, a little prep. And as you can see, I'm outside filming here in my garden. It's the late fall, so a lot of things are dormant. But one of the ways that we can connect with our more ancient ancestors, of course, is to be outside. So just a little tip for you right off the top. If you're wanting to connect further back than, say, the last 100 years or 200 years, get outside, because most of our ancestors spent more time outside than we do currently in our mainstream society, at least at the time I'm filming this video. So welcome. Welcome, dear one. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad that you are undertaking this journey with me to connect with the ancestors and the ancestral spirits. And you know what? I'm sure that they, the ancestors, are glad that you are here too. In fact, most likely it is they, the ancestors, who have called you to undertake this journey, to connect with this powerful and healing energy. So right off the top, I would like to talk just a little bit about who are the ancestors. In general, I don't mean just, who are your ancestors, or who are your ancestors that you know of, but who and what are the ancestors? And I'd like to talk about this, in the only way that I can from my own understanding, but that's based on a lot of different traditions, and maybe I should just share a little bit about my own experience with this, or vantage point right off the beginning. I think many of you know this watching, but just in case you don't, I am a professional psychic medium. I do medium readings where I help people connect with their passed on loved ones who have died. And I do readings also to help people with their life purpose, their relationships, their career, more of like the here and now. So I do different kinds of readings, but a portion of the work that I do is in connecting with the spirit world directly. And I guess you might say the ancestors, because, sometimes it's a husband or wife that has passed on, or a child, but often it is somebody in the ancestral line. So maybe this is partly where my interest in this comes in. I am also a spiritualist reverend. So I'm trained in the spiritualist tradition of mediumship, and do sit in circles sometimes and hold seance and connect in that way. And then another huge part of my background, of course, as many of you, I was raised in America, and so there is a Christian influence in my life. Which modern-day Christianity doesn't do much, or as much, with ancestor veneration. But if you look at the Catholic Church even, and the veneration of saints, those saints were supposedly living people who died. They are like spiritual ancestors to everyone who prays to them and follows them. So, there is some connection, even though I'm not Roman Catholic, wasn't raised that way. But still, in the Christian tradition, there is some influence with that. And especially if you go back a few hundred years, there are more customs around remembering our ancestors, even in the quote-unquote Christian tradition. And then I also grew up in the pagan tradition. That was part of my training early on. In the, I guess you call it neo-pagan or Wiccan or whatever words. I like to just say earth-based tradition, but it is specifically pagan. And currently I identify greatly with the Norse paganism tradition, and connecting with my own ancestors from Northern Europe. And then also the Celtic ancestors, and who knows where else I may have ancestors. So my point in this little bit of sharing here about where I'm coming from is just to help you understand my perspective, where some of these ideas might have come forth within me. And then, of course, I've also done research, and I think that's always useful to even just meet people and ask them about what their experiences are with the ancestors. So I'll be bringing all of this into our classes and videos and materials for you. But whatever tradition you identify with, or maybe you don't have a tradition, quote unquote, of spirituality, maybe you're just spiritual. Maybe you're just starting to become spiritual. That's fine, because connecting with your ancestors can be a part of any spiritual tradition. So let's look at this ancestor connection. Let's look at this maybe going further back. And, who are the ancestors? Let's get back to that, okay? When we talk about connecting with the ancestors, who do I mean? Do I mean your mother, your father? Do I mean your male ancestors only, your female ancestors only? Do I mean who, where, what, when? Well, let me give you the short version of it, and then we'll go in more depth. And actually, I should say before we go any further that, whenever you're dealing in the spirit realm, and we are definitely dealing in the spirit realm here when we speak of the ancestors, we do go a little bit far down the rabbit hole in terms of looking at things from more quantum reality, looking at parallel realities, looking at multidimensionality. In other words, the spirit world is not as fixed as this physical world, and it's not as easy to define. So I'm just going to let you know in advance, we're probably going to go down the rabbit hole a little bit in these classes. If you've never heard that phrase, it means we're going to go into some uncharted territory, some unusual topics at times. Paradox. So, but let's just start out with the simple version here, especially if you're, maybe a little pressed for time. So, for the purpose of these classes, who are the ancestors? Who should you communicate with? Who will you communicate with? And I'll probably do a separate video about that and just talk about it more in the classes, actually. But I would encourage you, if you can, to start with a person whom you actually know of. In other words, an actual ancestor that is closer in contemporary timeline to our time. So if you have a mother who has passed, or a father, or a grandmother, or an aunt, or an uncle, maybe even an elder sibling, if there's somebody that you know of, I mean, you don't even have to remember them, but if it's somebody that you can identify in your blood or family line, and if you're adopted, your family line can be the blood or your actual family who raised you. So, but again, I want you to start with maybe one or two specific ancestors if you can. And we'll talk more about how to select those persons, but most likely, if you're taking these courses, you might already have somebody in mind. Now, you might not, and that's okay too. But if you have somebody in mind, start with that one person or two. I mean, I wouldn't try to do more than 3 or 4 at once. That's a lot, okay? And truly, it would be worthwhile to undertake the venture of just communicating with one at a time, especially if you're new to the ancestor connection, but maybe 1 or 2. And if you're married or in partnership with someone, and you also wanted to maybe help them bring in some contact with their ancestor, you could do that too, but probably you should concentrate on your own family ancestor if you can, unless you were very close to that in-law who passed or that grandparent on the married side who passed. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, just ask me in the comments below and I'll clarify further whatever you need clarified on that. And I think that's just a good idea for the purposes of these classes, for you to actually own the information that will be shared and the inspiration, and for you to use it. So you can put these ideas into practice best if you start to think about now, who would be that 1 or 2 ancestors, or maybe 3 or 4 if you need to be an overachiever, okay? But who would be that person that you know of that you're interested in going further with? And let me help you a little bit on that too. I mean, how do you pick that person? Um, I mean, you know me, I'm a psychic, so I just really want to answer that by saying, hey, just follow your intuition. You'll know, it will feel right. And that's true. Uh, but some of you might need a little bit more, I think, guidance than that, structure. So, you know, in the old days, let me just share this with you. This is getting into some of the ideas, the ancient ideas around ancestors. And it's nearly universal. I don't know if it's completely universal, but if you start to do research into ancient pre-Christian tribal religions, and especially pre-monotheistic, but even many monotheistic religions, it's true too. Um, Basically, before modern times, and especially before Christianity really started taking things over, ancestor veneration and worship and acknowledging of the ancestors was pretty much everywhere. If you have ancestors, in other words, if you're here, then you are descended from people somewhere, somehow, who practice the honoring of the ancestors. This is just something that humans tend to do, is to honor their ancestors who have gone on. Now, every tribe would have different ways of doing this. And when I say tribe, I want to be clear here that I'm not just like speaking of, you know, Native American tribes or African tribes or Australian tribes or South American tribes. We all come from tribal people. Let us never forget that. Let us never forget, if you go far back enough, we all come from people who lived more in harmony in nature, and they had their tribes and they had their way of doing things. Now, every tribe is different, and that's true in Native America, by the way. You know, sometimes we try to group all Native Americans together, but they're not all the same. Each tribe has its own individual identity. So, and we're all descended from many tribes, most likely. I mean, especially here in America, we are truly the genetic melting pot. But I also think that's true in Europe. I mean, the whole DNA test thing has proven that the more people that get that, the more they are, we are shocked by, you know, how many different bloodlines we have in us. So anyway, I digress here. That's another subject for another time. But generally, if you look around and study what we know of some of these more ancient practices, and even coming more forward into modern times, the ancestors that were most venerated, well, there were certain criteria. In other words, just being a mother or a father or an aunt or an uncle or whatever, it didn't mean that you were going to be honored as an ancestor when you died, necessarily. So to be an ancestor was like a status in many of these tribal situations. And generally the ancestors that were going to be the most revered, well, I mean, think about it. Who do you think that would be? That would be those who really led stand-up lives, who gave to the people in their families or their villages. And keep in mind, in a tribal society, almost everybody would be related, so the village would be your family, not just your nuclear family. You know, we kind of get, in modern times, fixated on that small unit of family, like a mother and a father and just their children. But, you know, for example, I mean, yes, you might honor those ancestors if your mother or father died, but maybe you could be a second cousin and you might be honoring, you know, an aunt or an uncle, for example. I don't know, a great aunt or uncle. Because in tribal villages, they would all be closely related. So, to be an ancestor worthy of honoring, I mean, you had to live a life worthy of honoring. So this is why I personally would say this about choosing your ancestors to connect with. I don't know what other people necessarily would say on this, but I would say there are two kinds of ancestors, two types, two groups of ancestors we might choose to communicate with, two kinds of ancestors. And it sort of depends on the reason why we're trying to communicate. And maybe we might pick one of each. There are ancestors like the ones I'm talking about here who were maybe more heroic or more giving. They led lives of great honor. They contributed to the community. When people died, they were really missed, okay? And often those people were venerated not only by their immediate family members, in other words, a nuclear family, but a broader group of family and or friends. Maybe in a way, they become a spiritual ancestor for people who were not related by blood, but they were related by community bonds. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Because definitely in the tribal world, there is the bloodline. But remember, they didn't know for a long time about, say, fraternity. I mean, they knew who your mother was, so we're going to see, like in the ancient pre-Viking and pre-Germanic societies, you see the Disir. So these are the female ancestral spirits, so they would trace it that way. But there is also this idea that family was a more looser construct. I mean, so you have your blood connection, but then also, family is just this group of people living together. I say just, it's people who are bound to each other, who take care of each other. So you can have what you might call spiritual family. You can have spiritual ancestors. Certainly this is true if you have a teacher who has passed to the other side. Like my teachers who have passed, and there are some, they are part of my spiritual family. I think some of us even feel this way about some of the more famous teachers, even some people that we haven't met. I did meet her actually a few times, but I didn't know her personally, like Louise Hay. Whether you met Louise Hay or not, I know many people in life here. She's passed a year or two ago from when I made this video. Very influential New Age teacher. She wrote You Can Heal Your Life, if you haven't read that book. And many of us, feel a spiritual connection with her, even on the other side. Dr. Wayne Dyer is another one like that in contemporary times. So, for example, these are other ancestral type connections. It doesn't always have to be bloodline. There, I've addressed that, at least enough for now. And that might be something we get into more in the classes or not, just see if we need to. So, but think about now the two types of ancestral communications, or two reasons, two types of ancestors. One is the ancestor that you want to communicate with because they led that outstanding life. In other words, they earned the right to be called an ancestor, to be in the hall of ancestors. They were a person in life who gave, who loved, who cared, who showed up. And, generally, if you have someone like that who is a part of your family tree, there will be stories about them. They will be good stories. I can think of a grandma who I don't really remember, but she is one whom I really identify with. And the stories about her, she was very loving and very kind and took in, quote unquote, foster kids before there really was foster kids. So she took in kids that needed home, and she read the tarot card and did a lot of things, right, that I can kind of identify with, and I feel they make her worthy of that ancestor veneration. So therefore, I will venerate her. I will want to communicate with her because she is an ancestor. I feel I would seek for guidance. That's what I'm saying. In this first category, which, by the way, in these classes here, we're really focusing on this first category here. We are focusing on who are the ancestors that you want to reach out to for guidance, for help, for assisting you with that feeling of strength and confidence and security and peace. That's what we're focused on as group one. Now, there is another group, and really, if you look at a lot of these ancient societies, they wouldn't even mess with the second group, but it's become more common in modern times to work with healing ancestral patterns, especially with those ancestors who maybe didn't lead such great lives, okay? Maybe, your dad was an alcoholic and beat you, or maybe, I don't know, your mom left you, or maybe you had a grandparent who, I don't know, maybe they weren't a bad person or anything, but maybe you don't connect with them, but there's some sort of family pattern being passed down, or maybe it hasn't even passed down, but maybe you feel called to help that ancestor. Sometimes people work with this group of ancestors, especially if it's somebody you knew and you feel had traumatized you or passed down something negative, a lot of times we work with this type of ancestor really for our own self purposes, to help break the pattern for us and then also those behind us. But then sometimes we might hear about an ancestor who seems to not be at rest, and we might choose to try to send energy backwards. It's not really backwards, but try to send energy through the veil, through time, to help them to strengthen. You want to be careful about doing that kind of work at first. I mean, especially trying to help them. And I would even say I wouldn't focus too much all the time on just breaking ancestral patterns. I do think that it can be worthy work, but it's like cleansing of any kind. Cleansing of any kind takes great energy, and it is tiring and exhausting, and it is not strengthening. I mean, the long-term results can be strengthening, or the long-term results are lightening, right? But I would recommend, and we will focus on this in these classes, working with an ancestor who is a more vibrant living energy, whose energy extends even after death, because they got their stuff together a little bit. They loved, they lived, they were a little larger than life, or at least to you. They don't have to be famous, by the way. It's just, do you feel that love? Do you feel that? Are you inspired by that ancestor? So that's what I would think about with this, and this gives you an idea maybe of who are the ancestors you want to lean into. And listen, if there is somebody in your family line, like a parent or whatever, that you're kind of thinking, man, I don't want to communicate with that person. They were not nice people, or just didn't live life good. You don't have to, okay? You don't have to make a particular effort to reach out to them. I mean, I would invite you to not hate them. I would invite you not to send them negative energies or dwell on that, because that's going to subtract from your field, because they're still your ancestor. They're still in your family clan. But you don't have to concentrate on them, okay? I think that's important to know that. And then the other thing is, I've been talking about this like you pick thing, right? And it does happen that way sometimes. But in a way, I think they pick us. I really do. I think that, maybe we hear a story about an ancestor and we feel intrigued, and then that ancestor starts to give us little signs. So look for the signs if you're looking for a specific ancestor to begin connecting with. And I think that would be good if you can. And listen, if you don't know who that is right now, that's okay too. I want to nudge you in that direction, again, for the purposes of actually implementing what you're going to learn in this class, because it's harder to implement it if you're just going to do a general ancestor communication. Now, can you do a general ancestor communication? And I'll probably repeat this in other videos because I don't want you to miss it. Yes, you can set up your ancestral altar to the ancestors. You can leave offering to just the ancestors. And I do think there's still a power in that, a connection, and sometimes I just pray to the ancestors, or make offerings to them, or invite them to help me. I think there's nothing wrong with that. At the same time, I think that should be balanced with a more specific and targeted ancestral practice with specific ancestors, especially when you're working on a specific issue. If you needed help, like say in my family lineage, if I needed help dealing with family issues or maybe psychic reading issues, I might ask that one grandma I talked about. If, I don't know, maybe if I needed help with my son, I might ask my mom, even though she wasn't a perfect mother, but I figure she was still my mother. So, I don't, there's certain spirits that do things certain better. I mean, if there's somebody in your family that was into banking and finances when they were alive, that might be a good spirit to take your money problems to. We'll get more into that in the classes. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. And I want to kind of backtrack here a little bit. Let me see where we're at for time on the video. You know what? This one has gone long enough. So I'm going to stop it here. I want to talk a little bit more about what role the ancestors play in um, in all of this, in this whole grand scheme of spirit communication and our spiritual paths. But that's going to be a separate video for a separate time. So something to look forward to. Until next time, just begin thinking about, who is that ancestor going to be that you want to focus on communicating with, or that one or two. And you might start looking for some pictures of them or something that belonged to them, if you can find that. If not, at least write their name down on a piece of paper. And maybe, if it's going further back and like what period they're from, you could get a piece of clothing that represents that time. It doesn't have to be antique or anything. But, just something that could be a symbol of a hobby. I mean, if it was, let's say you had an ancestor going far back who was a horseshoe maker, or worked with horses, you could have a horseshoe, right? That you carry with you or place on an altar or just have around. These are some real simple ideas to get you started. We're just getting started on the journey, though, dear one, and we're going to go a lot more in depth to this. So I would encourage you to start with these ideas. Until next time, love to you all, and may the blessings of the ancestors be upon you.